There are encounters that change everything, when two completely opposite worlds collide, when innocence confronts cruelty, when a child challenges an empire built on contempt. That day, in the lands of one of America's greatest fortunes, a cruel billionaire burst into harsh laughter upon hearing an 8-year-old child say he could cure him. The man, who had spent millions on the world's best doctors, scoffed with all the contempt he could muster, humiliating that poor child who dared to defy science. But the boy's calm response would change everything forever. Alexander Whitmore had everything money could buy, except one thing: the ability to walk. At 52, he commanded a multi-billion-dollar empire from his wheelchair, and this only intensified his bitterness. His 300-acre estate in the countryside was more than a residence. It was a monument to his power and his contempt for humanity. On that September morning, Alexander was in his office dismissing yet another employee. The gardener had committed the unforgivable crime of stepping on the freshly cut lawn with dirty shoes. "You're pathetic," Alexander said, his voice laced with venom. 20 years working here, and you still haven't learned that perfection is not optional on this property. You're fired, and don't expect references." The 60-year-old man pleaded, spoke of his grandchildren, his wife's medical bills, but Alexander merely smiled coldly. "You should have thought of that before you dirtied my lawn, James. Escort this man out." This was how Alexander Whitmore lived, wielding absolute power over others' lives, finding sadistic pleasure in their humiliation. His employees feared him, his partners respected him out of fear, and he fed on the terror he inspired. After the gardener was removed from the property, Alexander turned his attention to the stack of medical reports on his desk. 5 years had passed since the accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. 5 years of spending fortunes on the world's best doctors, trying to find a cure that seemed not to exist. "Dr. Harrison called from London," announced Martha, his secretary of 15 years. "The results of the experimental tests are in." Alexander picked up the phone expectantly, but as always, the conversation ended in frustration. Another failed attempt, more millions wasted. The English doctor, one of the world's greatest neurologists, confirmed what all the others had already said. There was no known cure for his specific condition. "Incompetent," Alexander muttered, slamming the phone down. "All of them, decades of study, diplomas hanging on the wall, and none can do what I pay to have done." It was then that James, his personal security, entered the office with a confused expression on his face. "Mr. Whitmore, there's a child at the gate, a young boy, must be about 8 years old. He says he needs to speak with you." Alexander laughed with disdain. "A child? What would a child want with me? Must be some beggar. Send him away." "I've tried, sir, but he insists. He says he can, well, this is going to sound strange. He says he can cure you." The silence that followed was heavy. Alexander stared at James as if he had gone completely mad. "He said what?" "That he can cure your legs, sir. I know it sounds crazy, but the boy seems determined. He's been out there for 2 hours in the sun, waiting." Alexander felt a mixture of anger and curiosity. How dared a child show up on his property making such absurd claims? But there was something in the situation that piqued his sadistic interest. Perhaps it was an opportunity for amusement. "Bring him here," Alexander ordered, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "Let's see what kind of charade this child has to offer." 15 minutes later, James returned, accompanied by the most determined boy Alexander had ever seen. David was small for his 8 years, dressed in simple but clean clothes, and his eyes shone with an impossible confidence for his age. He showed no hint of intimidation before the grandeur of the mansion or Alexander's imposing presence. "So, you're the boy who thinks he can cure me?" Alexander said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you know how many doctors, how many specialists, how many medical geniuses have tried to do exactly that?" David looked directly into Alexander's eyes, fearless, without hesitation. "I can cure your legs." he said simply. The laughter that exploded from Alexander echoed throughout the office. It was a cruel laugh, full of scorn and malice. "You can cure me? You?" Alexander pounded his hands on the desk, still laughing. "Kid, I spent $40 million on the world's best doctors. I've been to the renowned clinics, to top research hospitals. I brought specialists from Europe and Asia, and you, a poor kid who probably never stepped foot in a decent school, think you can do what they couldn't?" David remained motionless, his expression serene. "Doctors work with what they know," the boy replied. "I work with what they don't know." Alexander stopped laughing. There was something in the boy's calmness that deeply irritated him. "You know what, kid? You amuse me, so I'm going to make you an offer." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "If you can cure me, if you can make me walk again, I'll give you $1 million. $1 million. Enough money for you and your family to escape poverty forever." Alexander's cruel smile widened even further. "But when you fail, as you obviously will, I want you to leave here knowing you wasted my time with your childish fantasies. I want you to learn that there are limits between what people like you can dream and what people like me can buy." David simply nodded. "Prepare the check," the boy said, with a confidence that sent a strange shiver down Alexander's spine. For a moment, just for a moment, Alexander Whitmore felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. But he quickly pushed the feeling away. It was impossible, completely impossible. That boy was just another dreamer who would soon learn a harsh lesson about reality. Alexander decided that this absurd situation deserved his complete attention. It had been a long time since he had so much fun at someone's expense, and the arrogant innocence of that boy promised hours of sadistic entertainment. "James, cancel all my afternoon appointments," Alexander ordered, without taking his eyes off David. "I want enough time to watch this spectacle." The billionaire steered his wheelchair closer to the boy, studying him like a predator examining its prey. "Before we begin this charade, kid, let me educate you about the reality of my situation. Perhaps then you'll understand the magnitude of your ignorance." Alexander pressed a remote control, and a giant screen descended from the wall. Medical images began to appear. X-rays, MRI scans, complex graphs filled with incomprehensible numbers and medical terminology. "This," Alexander said, pointing to the images, "is the work of the greatest geniuses of modern medicine. Dr. Michael Harrison from a leading medical center, the man who revolutionized spinal neurology. Dr. Sarah Chen from a prominent research institution, a pioneer in regenerative therapies. Dr. Klaus Weber from a distinguished European clinic, creator of the most advanced neural reconstruction techniques." David remained silent, observing the images without showing any intimidation. "Each of these doctors," Alexander continued, his voice growing in intensity, "has decades of study, thousands of successful surgeries, international awards. They examined every nerve, every vertebra, every possibility of recovery in my body. And you know what they all told me?" Alexander paused dramatically, savoring the moment. "That there is no cure, that the injury to my spinal cord is irreversible, that not all the science in the world can undo what happened to me. Now tell me, little boy, what qualification do you have that these giants of medicine don't?" David finally spoke, his calm voice cutting through Alexander's arrogance like a sharp blade. "They look at what's broken. I see what can be fixed." The simplicity of the answer irritated Alexander deeply. How dared a child speak of medicine with such confidence? How dared he challenge decades of scientific knowledge with phrases that sounded like childish riddles? "That's not an answer. It's cheap poetry," Alexander exploded. "Medicine is science, kid. It's exams, diagnoses, proven treatments. It's not pretty phrases spoken by children who can't even read properly." But David remained unperturbed. He walked to one of the office windows, observing the perfectly manicured gardens of the estate. "How many years have you been in that chair, sir?" the boy asked. 5, Alexander replied suspiciously. "Why?" And in 5 years, how many times have you tried to stand up? Alexander laughed with disdain. Tried to stand up? That's ridiculous. My spinal cord is severely injured. Trying to stand up would be like trying to fly, physically impossible. You gave up before you even tried, David observed, turning to face the billionaire. The doctors said it was impossible, and you believed them. You stopped fighting. The fury that exploded in Alexander was instantaneous and devastating. Gave up? He shouted, pounding his fists on the arms of the chair. I spent $40 million trying to cure myself. I went through 17 experimental surgeries. I tested drugs that haven't even been approved yet. I did therapies that lasted months, treatments that left me closer to death than to a cure. And you have the audacity to say I gave up? Martha, the secretary, appeared at the door, alarmed by the shouts, but Alexander dismissed her with a furious gesture. Do you know the difference between me and you, kid? Alexander continued, his voice now dangerously low. I have power. I have money. I have access to the best in the world. You have nothing. Nothing. You live in a house that probably costs less than what I spend on shoes a month. You never stepped foot in a university, never read a medical book, never even seen the inside of a real hospital. Alexander pressed the remote control again. The screen now showed photos of luxurious hospitals, state-of-the-art medical equipment, laboratories that looked like spaceships. This is a world-renowned clinic where I spent 3 months. It cost $2.5 million. This is another leading medical center, another $4 million. A prestigious medical institution, $3.8 million. Have you ever seen money like that in your life, boy? David shook his head negatively, but did not seem minimally intimidated by the display of wealth. And yet, the boy said, you're still in the chair. The silence that followed was tense. Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. David's simple, direct observation cut through all his financial and medical defenses, exposing the naked truth he tried to avoid. Despite all his money and power, he remained a broken man. That's different, Alexander murmured, but his voice had lost some of its previous strength. Is it? David asked, taking a step towards the wheelchair. You spent millions trying to fix what's broken. I can heal what never stopped working. That doesn't make sense. Neurologically speaking, it's impossible. You trust doctors more than yourself, David interrupted. They said there was no hope, and you stopped hoping. They said there was no cure, and you stopped believing you could be cured. Alexander felt something strange happening in his chest. It was as if David's words were awakening something that had been buried for a long time under layers of bitterness and disillusionment. You don't understand, Alexander said, but his voice sounded less convinced. Modern medicine is exact. There are physical limits that cannot be crossed. My body has been examined by the best. And what if the best are wrong? David asked, his eyes meeting Alexander's with a disturbing intensity. For the first time in 5 years, Alexander Whitmore did not have an immediate answer, and that frightened him more than he was willing to admit. Alexander couldn't get David's question out of his head all night. The words, "What if the best are wrong?" echoed in his mind like a hammer hitting metal. By morning, his irritation had turned into something close to fury. "James!" he shouted as soon as he woke up. "Bring that boy! Here now." An hour later, David was again in the office with the same unwavering calmness as the day before. Alexander had spent the night preparing what he considered his ultimate arsenal against the arrogance of that child. "Sit down," Alexander ordered, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. "Yesterday you planted a ridiculous doubt in my head, and today I'm going to eliminate that doubt once and for all." Alexander pressed several remote controls, and the office transformed into a kind of medical classroom. Screens descended from the walls, projectors activated, and suddenly the room was filled with medical images, diplomas, certificates, and documents. "This," Alexander said, gesturing broadly, "is irrefutable proof that you are nothing but a delusional child with fantasies of miraculous healing. The first screen showed a gold-framed diploma. Dr. Richard Kellerman, a prestigious medical university, summa cum laude, advanced neurosurgery. Dr. Kellerman, Alexander announced, with exaggerated reverence, spent 17 years studying only cases like mine. 17 years. He wrote 43 scientific articles on spinal cord injuries, revolutionized 3 surgical techniques, and saved over 2,000 patients. When he examined me for 8 straight hours and said there was no cure, do you think he was lying? David observed the images in silence, showing no sign of intimidation. Alexander switched to the next screen. Dr. Helen Volkoff, a renowned institute of advanced medicine. She developed the world's most advanced cell therapy, tested it on me for 6 months, cost $12 million. Result, 0. Nothing. Do you think you know more than her? One after another, Alexander displayed the credentials of the doctors who had treated him. Dr. Kato Tanaka from a major city, world expert in neural regeneration. Dr. Francois Dubois from a European capital, pioneer in spinal implants. Dr. Antonio Rossi from an Italian city, creator of the most sophisticated vertebral reconstruction technique in Europe. Specialists, Alexander declared, his voice growing in intensity. 23 of the best medical minds on the planet. Some won Nobel Prizes, others created techniques that saved thousands of lives. All of them, all came to the same conclusion. Alexander Whitmore will never walk again. Alexander paused dramatically, breathing heavily, as if he had run a marathon. And now, he said, his voice dripping with venom, an 8-year-old boy appears, probably. Illiterate, certainly ignorant of any basic concept of anatomy, and tells me he can do what these giants of medicine couldn't. Do you really think that makes any sense? David remained silent for a few seconds, observing all the medical images around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was even calmer than before. You trust these papers too much, sir. Papers? Alexander exploded. These are diplomas from top universities. They are international certifications, recognitions of medical excellence. These papers represent decades of scientific knowledge. And yet, David said, standing up from the chair, you're still sitting. The brutal simplicity of the observation hit Alexander like lightning. He looked around at all the screens filled with diplomas and certificates, at all the evidence of medical superiority he had gathered. And the inescapable reality remained. He was still stuck in that chair. That's different, Alexander stammered. Medicine has limitations. There are cases that are genuinely impossible to treat. For them, David said, pointing to the images of the doctors. Not for me. Alexander felt a toxic mixture of anger and something he couldn't identify. Perhaps it was fear. Fear that a child could be right where the world's best doctors were wrong. You have no idea what you're talking about, he shouted. These men and women dedicated their entire lives to medicine. They spent decades studying cases like mine. They have equipment that costs millions of dollars. And you want to tell me that with your empty little hands, you can do better? David walked to one of the screens that showed an MRI of Alexander's spine. He studied the image for a few seconds, then turned to the billionaire. Do you see this scan? He asked, pointing to the screen. Of course I see it. It's my spine. It cost $15,000 to do this MRI on the best equipment in a major city. And what do you see when you look at that image? Alexander frowned, confused by the question. I see the injury to my spinal cord. I see the damage that left me paralyzed. I see the scientific proof that I cannot walk. David nodded slowly. You only see what's broken. That's why you remain broken. That doesn't make any medical sense, Alexander protested, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. It doesn't have to make sense to them, David said, gesturing to the images of the doctors. It needs to make sense to you. For the first time, Alexander found himself without an immediate answer. He looked again at all the diplomas, all the certificates, all the evidence of medical superiority he had accumulated, and for the first time in 5 years, a small voice in his mind whispered a question he had refused to consider. What if all this was wrong? 3 days passed since their last meeting, but Alexander couldn't get David out of his head. The question, what if all this was wrong, had become an obsession that kept him awake every night. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the absolute truths on which he had based his life. That morning, Alexander had made a decision. He was going to prove once and for all that the boy was a fraud. He summoned Dr. Peterson, his personal physician of 3 years, for an emergency consultation. "Doctor," Alexander said when the doctor arrived, "I want you to explain to me definitively and irrefutably why it's impossible for me to walk again. I want solid scientific evidence." Dr. Peterson, a 60-year-old man with grey hair and thick glasses, seemed surprised by the urgency of the request. "Mr. Whitmore, we have discussed this extensively. Your spinal cord injury is classified as complete. That means there is no sensory or motor function preserved below the level of the injury. It is medically impossible." "Impossible based on what?" Alexander interrupted, surprising the doctor with the question. "Based on decades of neurological research, on thousands of documented cases, But what if there's something medicine doesn't understand yet?" Alexander asked, feeling strange for questioning the very science he had blindly trusted. Dr. Peterson adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitmore, medicine is not based on what-ifs. It's based on evidence, on proven facts. What you're suggesting borders on, the mystical." The word mystical hit Alexander like a slap. It was exactly what he feared he was considering. Something irrational, unscientific, childish, but at the same time, a part of him wanted to explore that impossible possibility. That afternoon, when David arrived as agreed, Alexander was armed with new medical information, but also with a dangerous curiosity he couldn't suppress. "Sit down, boy," Alexander said, his voice less hostile than in previous days. "I have some questions for you." David settled into the chair, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. "First," Alexander began, "I want you to explain to me exactly how you intend to cure me. And don't give me poetic phrases. I want concrete details." "Do you really want to know?" David asked. "Or do you want information to prove me wrong?" The question caught Alexander off guard. That was exactly what he was doing. Looking for ammunition to destroy the hopes that, against his will, were beginning to germinate in his heart. "I want the truth," Alexander said, and realized he truly did. David stood up and walked to the window, observing the gardens. "Have you noticed that your legs haven't disappeared?" "What do you mean by that?" "They're still there. Your heart still pumps blood to them. Your muscles still exist. Your bones are still solid. None of that died." Alexander looked down at his own immobile legs under the blanket. It was true. They were there, seemingly normal, just silent. "But the spinal cord," Alexander began, "is injured, not dead," David interrupted. "When you were a child and cut yourself, your skin healed on its own, didn't it? That's different. The spinal cord doesn't regenerate like skin. Doctors said that, all of them. It's an established medical fact." David turned to face Alexander directly. "Have you ever tried talking to your legs?" Alexander almost laughed, but there was something in David's seriousness that stopped him. "Talk to my legs? That's absurd. You talk to your heart when you're nervous. You talk to your head when you're thinking. Why not talk to your legs when you want them to move?" "Because that's not scientific," Alexander protested, but his voice sounded less convincing. "So what?" David asked simply. The silence that followed was disturbing. Alexander realized that he had spent 5 years relying exclusively on science, on medicine, on specialists, and that had given him nothing but more hopelessness. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was something beyond what doctors could measure and diagnose. "That's ridiculous," Alexander murmured, but he was looking at his legs with a different expression. "Are you afraid?" David observed. "Afraid? Afraid of what?" "Of trying and finding out it can work. Because if it works, you'll have to admit that you wasted 5 years believing you were broken forever." Alexander felt as if David had just read his soul. It was exactly that. He was afraid of hope. He was afraid to believe there could be a way out. Because if there was, and he found out too late, the pain would be unbearable. "The doctors are clear," Alexander said, but his voice was weak. "Complete spinal cord injury results in permanent paralysis. That has been verified dozens of times." "By the same doctors who said you'd never feel anything below your waist again?" David asked. Alexander frowned. "Yes, and they were right. I don't feel anything." David walked to Alexander's chair and, without asking permission, placed his hand on the billionaire's knee. "Did you feel that?" "No, of course not. I already said." "Are you sure?" Alexander paused. There was something, not exactly a sensation, but an awareness, as if a very deep part of him knew that something had touched his leg. That's impossible," Alexander murmured, looking at David's hand on his knee. "For whom?" David asked. "For you, or for the doctors?" For the first time in 5 years, Alexander Whitmore felt something he had buried so deeply he thought it had died. Hope. And that terrified him more than any medical diagnosis ever had. A week had passed since David touched Alexander's knee, and the billionaire hadn't slept a single full night. That strange sensation, that impossible awareness that something had touched his leg, wouldn't leave his mind. He had tried to rationalize, to explain scientifically, even to lie to himself, saying he had imagined it all. But the truth remained. For a moment he had felt something. That morning, Alexander made the most frightening decision of his life. He dismissed all the staff from the mansion, cancelled all meetings, and sent Martha home. He wanted to be completely alone with David when he attempted the impossible. "Are you sure about this?" James, the security guard, asked before leaving. "Being alone with the boy?" "I am," Alexander replied, though his voice trembled slightly. "And James, I don't want to be disturbed by anything at all." When David arrived at noon, he found Alexander in the center of the office, away from his desk, away from all the screens with medical diplomas, away from everything that represented his identity as a rich and powerful man. He was just there in his wheelchair, vulnerable and frightened like a child. "I've thought a lot about what you said," Alexander began, his voice lower than usual. "About talking to my legs, about things medicine doesn't understand, about hope." David nodded in silence, respecting the difficulty of that moment for the billionaire. "For 5 years," Alexander continued, "I relied completely on science. When the doctors said it was impossible, I accepted it as absolute truth. I stopped trying, I stopped believing, I stopped living. In fact," Alexander looked at his hands, avoiding David's gaze, "you asked me a question I can't get out of my head. What if the best are wrong? What if there's something they don't understand?" Alexander swallowed hard. "What if I wasted 5 years of my life believing a lie?" "You didn't waste anything," David said softly. "You needed that time to get here, to be ready." "Ready for what?" "To really try." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, there was a determination in them that hadn't existed in years. "What do you need me to do?" David walked until he was directly in front of Alexander's chair. "First, you need to stop thinking like a patient." "What do you mean?" "Patients are sick people waiting for others to cure them. You're not a patient. You're a person who forgot how to use a part of your body." Alexander felt a subtle shift in his perception. It was as if David had changed the focus of a camera, and suddenly he was seeing the same situation from a completely different angle. "Now," David said, "I want you to close your eyes and remember the last time you walked." "This is going to hurt," Alexander murmured, but closed his eyes anyway. "Remember the feeling. Not the accident, not the pain. Remember the feeling of standing, of taking a step, of feeling the ground beneath your feet. Alexander forced himself to go back. In time, before the accident, before the chair, before all the bitterness. He remembered walking through the estate gardens, climbing stairs, feeling the firm earth beneath his feet. "Can you feel it?" David asked. "I can remember," Alexander replied, his voice laden with emotion. "Not remember, feel it now." Alexander frowned, concentrating intensely, and then something impossible happened. For a fleeting moment, he felt as if his feet were touching the ground, not physically, but in some deeper, more real way than physical reality itself. I felt something," Alexander murmured, opening his eyes, surprised. "Now," David said, placing his hands on Alexander's shoulders, "speak to your legs." That's absurd." "It is. Just do it." Alexander hesitated, feeling ridiculous, but he had come too far to turn back now. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say you miss them. Say you want them to work again. Say you need them." Alexander looked at his immobile legs. For 5 years, he had seen them as a dead part of his body, as evidence of his incapacity. Now, for the first time, he tried to see them as David suggested, as a part of himself that had simply forgotten how to function. I miss you," Alexander said, his voice broken with emotion. "I miss walking, getting up, being whole." Tears began to stream down Alexander's face, years of pain and frustration finally finding a release. "I need you," he continued, now speaking directly to his legs. "I need to be who I was. Forgive me for giving up. Forgive me for stopping believing." David kept his hands on Alexander's shoulders, and the billionaire could feel a strange energy emanating from the boy. It was nothing that could be measured or explained scientifically, but it was real, more real than all the medical exams he had undergone. "Now," David said, his voice almost a whisper, "try to stand up." Alexander's heart pounded. "I can't. Physically, it's impossible." "Forget what's physically possible. Just try." Alexander placed his hands on the arms of the chair, as he had tried to do thousands of times in the past 5 years, but this time it was different. This time he wasn't trying to prove he could walk. He was trying to remember how to walk. He pushed with his arms, trying to lift himself. Nothing happened, as always. But then David placed a hand on Alexander's chest, right over his heart. "Don't just use your arms," the boy said. "Use everything. Use the anger you felt for 5 years. Use the pain of being betrayed by your own body. Use the hope that was hidden. Use everything." Alexander closed his eyes again, and for the first time in 5 years, tried to stand up with every fiber of his being, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, with all the willpower he had accumulated during years of frustration. And then something miraculous happened. His legs trembled. Alexander opened his eyes, shocked. David smiled for the first time since they met. "Again," the boy said, "stronger." Alexander took a deep breath and tried again. This time, in addition to his legs trembling, he felt a strange sensation rising up his spine, as if long dormant electrical circuits were being reconnected. "This is impossible," Alexander murmured, but there was real hope in his voice for the first time in years. "For whom?" David asked, echoing the question he had asked several times. And Alexander Whitmore, for the first time in 5 years, had no answer based on medical limitations. He had only a growing feeling that the impossible was about to become reality. The trembling in Alexander's legs intensified. They weren't involuntary spasms. They were conscious movements, as if his muscles were awakening from a deep sleep. The billionaire looked at his own legs with a mixture of terror and wonder. "This can't be happening," Alexander murmured, but his voice was laden with emotion, not denial. 5 years. 5 years. I believed." "You believed what you needed to believe at that moment," David said softly. "But now you don't need to anymore. Alexander tried to stand up again, this time with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. He leaned on the arms of the chair and slowly began to transfer weight to his legs. They trembled under the pressure, unstable after so long without use, but they responded. "They're responding," Alexander whispered, tears streaming down his face. "My God, they're really responding." With David offering support, Alexander managed to partially lift himself from the chair. His shaky legs could barely support his weight, but they were working. For the first time in 5 years, Alexander Whitmore was standing. "I don't believe it," he said, his voice broken with emotion. $40 million in medical treatments, the best specialists in the world, and an 8-year-old boy managed to do what they said was impossible. Alexander sat down again, exhausted by the effort, but radiant. He looked at David with an expression completely different from all the previous days. There was no more contempt, no more arrogance. There was gratitude, admiration, and something he hadn't felt in decades: humility. "How?" Alexander asked. "How did you know it was possible when all the doctors said it wasn't?" David sat in the chair opposite the billionaire, looking even younger and wiser at the same time. "Doctors look at what's broken and try to fix it. I look at what never stopped working and help it remember. But how did you learn to do that? Where? Did you study? Who taught you?" David smiled sadly. "My mother was very sick. Doctors said she was going to die. She didn't die because I learned that sometimes the body just needs to remember how to be healthy again." Alexander felt a tightening in his heart. He had spent the whole week questioning David's qualifications, despising him for his humble origins, and now he discovered that the boy had developed this extraordinary gift, trying to save his own mother. "Your mother, was she cured?" "She was," David replied, "but the doctors said it was luck. They said there was no scientific explanation, so she started believing them instead of believing what had happened." Alexander understood the tragedy implicit in the answer. David's mother had been cured, but had chosen to believe in science instead of believing in the miracle. "And you?" Alexander asked. "Why did you decide to help me?" David was silent for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "Because you are like she was, sick. Not only in body, but in heart. You lost hope. Lost faith in yourself, lost the ability to believe you could be cured." David's words hit Alexander like a flash of clarity. He had spent 5 years focused only on physical paralysis, without realizing that the real illness was the emotional and spiritual paralysis that had set in his life. $1 million, Alexander said suddenly, remembering the promise he had made mockingly. "You really cured me. The money is yours." David shook his head. "I don't want your money." Alexander was confused. "But you cured me, you did the impossible. $1 million is the least I can—" "You still don't understand," David interrupted. "The cure wasn't what happened to your legs. The cure was what happened to your heart." Alexander paused to process the words. It was true. Yes. His legs were working again, but the deepest change had happened elsewhere. For the first time in decades, he felt human, connected, with something greater than his own power. And wealth. "So, what do you want?" Alexander asked. "I want you to remember what you learned here," David said, getting up to leave. "I want you to remember that sometimes the answers are not in the most expensive books or in the most luxurious clinics. Sometimes they are in places we never thought to look." David walked towards the door, but Alexander called him. "Wait. Where are you going? How can I find you? How can I thank you properly?" David turned one last time with that serene smile he had kept all week. "You don't need to find me. You just need to remember not to give up on people whom others have already given up on. Remember that everyone deserves a second chance, even you." And with that, David left the office, leaving Alexander alone with his functioning legs and his heart, which had rediscovered the capacity for gratitude. 3 months had passed since the day David cured Alexander Whitmore. The billionaire's transformation had been so radical that those close to him barely recognized the man he had become. The first change had been with the employees. Alexander called back everyone he had unfairly dismissed over the years, including the 60-year-old gardener he had fired the day he met David. He not only rehired them, but significantly increased their salaries and created a comprehensive health plan for all employees and their families. "Mr. Peterson," Alexander said to the gardener on the day he returned, "I owe you an apology. What I did to you was cruel and unjust. I hope I can make it up to you somehow." The gardener, still wary, accepted the job back. With time, he saw that Alexander had truly changed. The man who once found pleasure in humiliating others now made a point of knowing each employee by name, asking about their families, and showing genuine interest in their well-being. The second transformation was in his business. Alexander began to completely rethink his business practices. Companies he had destroyed for pure sadistic pleasure received partnership proposals. Employees he had dismissed without just cause were sought out and rehired with promotions. He established a scholarship fund for employees' children and created a free medical assistance program for low-income families. But the most significant change was personal. Alexander had spent decades building walls between himself and the rest of humanity, using his wealth and power as barriers that isolated him from any real vulnerability. Now, for the first time in his adult life, he felt connected to other people in a genuine way. Martha, his secretary, was one of the first to notice the transformation. "Mr. Whitmore," she said one day, "you seem different, lighter somehow." Alexander smiled. A real, warm smile, not the cruel smile he used to wield as a weapon. "I am different, Martha. I learned that true strength doesn't come from having power over others, but from using that power to help them." The office had also changed. Alexander had removed all the screens with medical diplomas, all the symbols of superiority he had used to intimidate visitors. In their place, he put photos of his employees, their families, the social projects he had begun to finance. The wheelchair was still there in a corner of the office. Alexander had decided to keep it, not as a reminder of paralysis, but as a symbol of the humility he had learned. Sometimes, when making important decisions, he would sit in it for a few minutes to remember what it was like to feel powerless, so he would never forget the importance of compassion. 6 months after meeting David, Alexander received a call that would change his life once again. "Mr. Whitmore," said the voice on the other end of the line, "my name is Dr. Sarah Chen, from a children's hospital in a major city. We have a child here with a very rare neurological condition. The parents mentioned that you had an unconventional experience with healing. They would like to speak with you." Alexander felt his heart race. It was an opportunity to give back what David had done for him. "Tell the parents I'll be there in an hour," Alexander replied. "And Dr. Chen, sometimes the answers are in places that traditional medicine doesn't look for. Keep an open mind." When Alexander arrived at the hospital, he found a family devastated by pain. The parents, Maria and Carlos, were immigrants who had spent all their savings trying to cure their 7-year-old son, Pedro, who had lost the ability to speak after an accident. "Doctors said there's nothing more to do," Maria said, crying. "But we heard that you went through something similar, that you were cured by a child. Please, help us." Alexander looked at Pedro, a dark-haired boy with sad eyes who painfully reminded him of David. In that moment, he knew exactly what he needed to do. "I can't promise a cure," Alexander said, kneeling in front of Pedro. "But I can promise that we won't give up, and I can teach you something I learned. Sometimes healing begins when we stop accepting impossibility as the final answer." Alexander spent the next few weeks working with Pedro and his family, not trying to replicate exactly what David had done with him, but applying the principles he had learned. Hope instead of resignation, emotional connection instead of scientific coldness, faith in the ability to heal instead of passive acceptance of limits. Gradually, Pedro began to make sounds, then words, then complete sentences. Doctors called it an unexplained, spontaneous recovery. But Alexander knew the truth. Pedro had been cured by the same power that had cured him, the power of renewed hope and genuine human connection. 1 year after meeting David, Alexander Whitmore was a completely transformed man. He had created a foundation dedicated to helping families facing impossible diagnoses. He had reconnected with relatives he had pushed away with his cruelty. He had learned to find joy in simple things, a sincere conversation with an employee, a thank you letter from a family helped by his foundation, the feeling of walking through his estate gardens, not like a king inspecting his territory, but like a man grateful to be alive. And sometimes, when he was walking alone through the gardens, Alexander thought of the 8-year-old boy who had changed his life with a simple question: what if the best are wrong? He never saw David again, but he carried with him the most valuable lesson he had learned, that true healing doesn't happen only in the body, but in the heart, and that sometimes the greatest strength we can have is the humility to admit that we don't know everything, and the courage to believe in the impossible. Alexander Whitmore had offered $1 million for a cure. In the end, he received something far more valuable, a second chance to be human. And this time, he wouldn't waste that opportunity. The transformation was complete. The man who once scoffed at a child's hope now dedicated his life to planting seeds of hope in hearts that had given up. And in every life he touched, in every family he helped, Alexander kept alive the memory of the boy who had taught him that the greatest miracles happen when we stop believing in limitations and start believing in possibilities. Sometimes the greatest miracle doesn't happen in the body, but in the heart. And when someone discredited changes everything, who was truly broken? If this story touched you, leave a like, comment on what moved you. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next truths no one dares to tell. Here, every story is a mirror and perhaps a beginning of healing.